At 2:16 on May 6, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel stood on the bridge of USS Buckley when the radio crackled with urgency. An Avenger pilot overhead transmitted fresh coordinates. A German submarine had surfaced 20 miles ahead, west of the Cape Verde Islands. Abel was 34 years old. He had commanded Buckley for 11 months. Until this night, the destroyer escort had never faced a surfaced U-boat at close range. The contact ahead was U-66. It was no ordinary submarine. U-66 was the seventh most successful U-boat of the entire war. 33 Allied ships sunk, more than 200,000 tons sent to the bottom. Her patrol record stretched across the Atlantic like a trail of wreckage. She had been at sea since January, nearly 4 months without resupply. Fuel was low. Batteries were drained. Her crew was exhausted, but dangerous. Abel ordered flank speed, 23.5 knots. Buckley surged forward, slicing through calm Atlantic water under bright moonlight. Visibility was perfect. Too perfect. This would be a surface fight. No shadows, no concealment. The Avenger remained overhead, circling, feeding course corrections every few minutes. U-66 was recharging batteries, waiting for a supply submarine. She believed the ocean around her was empty. At 3:08, 3 red flares shot upward from the submarine. A recognition signal. The Germans thought Buckley was their supply boat. Abel held his fire and kept closing. 4,000 yards became 3. 3 became 2. The deception held, until it didn't. U-60SIXS lookouts realized the mistake at the last possible moment. A torpedo flashed from her bow. Abel reacted instantly. Hard left rudder. The torpedo streaked past Buckley's starboard side, missing by yards. At 3:20, Abel gave the order. Open fire. Buckley's 3-inch guns roared. The first salvo struck forward of the conning tower, a direct hit. U-60SIXS deck gun was knocked out instantly. Buckley's entire weapons suite joined in. 3-inch guns, 40mm, 20mm. Tracers tore across the submarine's hull. The U-boat answered with machine gun fire, but most rounds went high. Buckley's gunners hammered the conning tower again and again. Flames erupted. Germans were visible through the fire, scrambling, trying to fight back. At 3:24, U-66 fired another torpedo, this one from her stern tubes. Abel saw it coming. Hard right rudder. The torpedo crossed ahead of Buckley's bow, close enough to feel. The range collapsed to 20 yards. Parallel course. Point blank. Buckley raked U-66 from stem to stern. The submarine's conning tower burned fiercely now. In 16 minutes, Buckley fired 105 3-inch shells, 2,700 rounds of 20mm, and 418 rounds of 40mm ammunition. And then, there was no distance left to shoot. At 3:29, Abel made a decision no destroyer escort commander had made in modern naval warfare. Ram her. Hard right rudder. Buckley's bow climbed onto U-60SIXS forecastle and stayed there. Steel screamed against steel. The ships locked together. Then Germans began climbing out of the conning tower. Some carried pistols. Some had knives. They swarmed onto Buckley's deck. The Americans thought they were being boarded. What followed had not happened on a United States warship in over a century. Hand-to-hand combat at sea. Buckley's crew grabbed whatever they could, Thompson submachine guns, pistols, rifles. When the weapons ran dry, they fought with fists, with 3-inch shell casings, with coffee mugs torn from the galley. One German made it inside the ship. A steward's mate drove him back with a coffee pot. The fight lasted 2 minutes. Men fell on both sides. U-60SIXS first officer, Klaus Herbig, led the boarding party, trying to create a diversion, buy time for his captain to break free. But there were too many Americans. Too much firepower. Herbig shouted for surrender. Abel ordered engines reversed. Buckley backed away, leaving 5 armed Germans on her deck. They were subdued immediately. But U-66 was not finished. She came around under power and aimed directly for Buckley's starboard side. At 3:35, she struck. The collision tore open Buckley's engine room, sheared off the starboard propeller shaft, twisted the stern. As the submarine slid past, an American sailor looked down into the open conning tower and tossed a hand grenade inside. Fire blasted outward. U-66 kept moving, 15 knots, out of control, hatches open, Germans abandoning ship. At 3:41, She slipped beneath the surface. Diesel engines still running. Fire still burning inside. Her captain went down with her. 16 minutes after the first shot, U-66 was gone. Buckley had just fought the only hand-to-hand battle aboard a U.S. warship in World War II. But victory came at a cost. Buckley was crippled, engine room flooding, one propeller gone, 550 miles from the nearest port, and 36 German sailors were floating in the Atlantic. Able did not hesitate. He ordered rescue operations. The same men who had fought moments earlier now hauled exhausted U-boat sailors from the sea. Burned, wounded, broken. Naval tradition held firm. You save lives first. U-66 was finished. But Buckley still had to survive the ocean. Buckley survived because Brent Able made the right decisions at the right moments, and because his crew fought with everything they had, including coffee mugs. Now came the waiting. Able stood on the bridge, scanning the horizon. Ahead lay 6 days of slow sailing, 6 days exposed, 6 days hoping the Atlantic stayed calm and that no other U-boat found them. Buckley had won the strangest naval fight of the war, but victory did not mean safety. Not yet. Not with 1,500 miles of ocean still ahead. The first 24 hours were critical. Buckley maintained 13 knots on one engine, steering carefully northeast. Temporary welds sealed the torn hull, but damage control teams monitored every seam. One failure could flood compartments faster than pumps could keep up. The Atlantic stayed calm. Swells remained under 6 feet. That was luck. A storm would have torn the patches apart. On May 7th, air patrols from Block Island reported no submarine contacts within 200 miles. That did not mean safety. U-boats could remain submerged for extended periods, surfacing only at night. By May 8th, Buckley had covered 300 miles. More than 1,200 remained. The crew settled into routine. Damage control ran constant inspections. Lookouts searched for periscopes. Gun crews stayed manned. But another truth was spreading, confirmed by intercepted German signals. German Naval Command knew U-66 was gone. They knew how she had died. Rammed by a destroyer escort. Boarding attempt repelled. Hand-to-hand combat on deck. The report stunned them. U-boats were not boarded. They were destroyed at range, by depth charges, torpedoes, aircraft. Not by fists and galley equipment. Yet Buckley's action report was precise, detailed, undeniable. What bothered the Germans most were the coffee mugs. The phrase appeared 3 times in official documentation. Ammunition expended included several General Mess coffee cups. That line entered the U.S. Fleet Anti-Submarine Bulletin in June 1944. Medical examinations of the survivors confirmed it. Some German sailors bore injuries caused not by bullets, but by ceramic impacts, coffee mugs used as weapons in naval combat. The hand-to-hand fight had lasted 2 minutes. 2 minutes that rewrote assumptions about modern warfare. According to Buckley's report, Americans fired approximately 300 rounds of .45 caliber pistol ammunition, 60 rounds of rifle fire, 30 rounds of buckshot, and multiple bursts from Thompson submachine guns. But it was the improvised weapons, fists, shell casings, coffee equipment, that made the encounter unforgettable. Interrogations revealed one key detail. Klaus Herbig, U-60SIXS first officer, had led the boarding party knowing it was hopeless. His objective was simple: create a diversion. Give his captain time to break free. Herbig and roughly a dozen men climbed onto Buckley's forecastle armed with pistols and knives. They faced rifle fire from repair crews, Thompson fire from the bridge wings, and when American ammunition ran low, bare hands. Herbig survived. He surrendered once it was clear the diversion had failed. So did the German sailor who reached Buckley's interior. He slipped through an open hatch, hoping to sabotage something, maybe the radio room. Instead, he encountered a steward in the galley. The American grabbed the nearest object, a coffee pot, and drove him back toward the ladder until other crewmen arrived. The German surrendered. During interrogation, he admitted he had survived 9 patrols aboard U-66, endured depth charges and air attacks, but not a Navy cook with a coffee pot. By May 10th, Buckley was halfway to New York, 600 miles behind them, 600 still ahead. The port engine began showing strain. Oil pressure fluctuated. Temperature ran high. The chief engineer recommended reducing speed. Able agreed. Better slow than dead in the water. They dropped to 11 knots and adjusted course toward calmer seas. Morale aboard ship was strange, quiet, controlled. They had done something no U.S. Navy crew had done in over a century, yet every day at sea remained a gamble. On May 11th, another problem emerged. Starboard hull damage was worse than first assessed. Saltwater corrosion was spreading faster than expected. The welds held, but barely. Another storm could be fatal. Able checked weather reports obsessively. A high-pressure system held over the North Atlantic, stable for 72 hours. Beyond that, uncertainty. For days remained. For days hoping the weather held. For days hoping the engine survived. For days wondering if another U-boat was already tracking them. On May 12th, the first test arrived. A developing low-pressure system 400 miles northwest promised swells of 8 to 10 feet. Buckley's damaged hull could manage 6, maybe 7. 10 would be dangerous. Able altered course south, skirting the system's edge. The swells arrived by afternoon. 8 feet, then higher. Buckley pitched and rolled. The hull patches groaned with every wave. Below, the port engine labored. Oil pressure dropped. Temperature climbed. Power was reduced. Speed fell, 9 knots, then 8. At 8 knots, New York was 6 days away instead of 4. By May 13th, swells peaked near 9 feet. Water seeped through 2 patched sections, not flooding, but steady leaks. Damage control teams worked nonstop. The engine temperature climbed into the red. The chief engineer recommended shutdown for inspection. Able refused. Stopping meant drifting, helpless in mid-Atlantic. Instead, he ordered speed reduced to 6 knots. Enough to maintain steerage, enough to cool the engine. It worked. Temperature dropped slightly and stabilized. But 6 knots meant 8 days to New York. Every hour forced new calculations, new risks, new compromises. Meanwhile, the story of U-66 was spreading beyond military channels. Navy public affairs officers recognized its value immediately. An American destroyer escort defeating a legendary U-boat in hand-to-hand combat. They wanted details, photographs, interviews. But Buckley was still at sea, still damaged, still vulnerable. Celebration would have to wait. German survivors aboard Block Island confirmed the engagement. U-66 had attempted boarding. Herbig had led the effort. Close combat followed. Coffee mugs were real. Medical reports documented injuries consistent with ceramic impacts. What puzzled the Germans most was Abel's decision to ram. Destroyer doctrine did not include ramming. It was obsolete, something from the age of sail. But at 20 yards, Buckley had no space left to fight. Ramming was the only option, and it had worked. By May 14th, Buckley had covered 900 miles. 300 remained. Weather improved. Swells dropped to 6 feet. The engine stabilized at reduced power. The weld still held. Cautious optimism returned. Then the port engine oil pressure dropped sharply again. Bearing damage. They were 280 miles from port. Too far to drift. Too far to tow. Able ordered speed reduced to 4 knots, the absolute minimum to maintain steerage. The bearing held. Barely. At 4 knots, New York was 6 days away. Buckley continued forward, damaged, slow, exposed, but alive. And still undefeated. 6 days limping was still better than being dead in the water. On May 15th, Buckley's vulnerability was tested. At mid-morning, Block Island's air patrols detected a submarine contact 70 miles south of Buckley's position. The contact submerged before aircraft could attack. Course and intent were unclear. It might have been fleeing. It might have been circling. It might have been hunting. No one knew. And Buckley was making 4 knots. A surfaced U-boat could do 18. If the contact turned toward them, Buckley could not run, could not maneuver, could barely defend herself. Able ordered general quarters and waited. The submarine remained submerged for 6 hours. Avengers flew overlapping patrols, dropping sonobuoys, listening, tracking faint echoes beneath the surface. Every report was inconclusive. Tension aboard Buckley built with every minute. A crippled destroyer escort drifting through hostile waters was the easiest kind of target. At 1800 hours, the contact surfaced again, 60 miles south, moving west. Away from Buckley. Not hunting. Probably heading to a distant patrol zone. The threat passed, but the message was clear. They were exposed. 4 knots. 1 engine. Temporary hull patches. If a determined U-boat found them, there would be no second miracle. On May 16th, better news arrived. Weather forecasts predicted clear conditions for the next 72 hours. Calm seas. The port engine bearing was degrading, but holding. The chief engineer estimated they could maintain 4 knots for 4 more days, maybe 5 if luck held. New York lay 220 miles northeast. At 4 knots, they could make it, with little margin. Able received a message from Commander, Destroyer Force Atlantic. Buckley was front-page news. The New York Times had run the story on May 14th. The Associated Press followed. Radio broadcasts repeated it. A destroyer escort had sunk a German submarine in hand-to-hand combat. The coffee mugs were the hook. American sailors defeating elite U-boat crewmen with breakfast dishes. It sounded like propaganda. It wasn't. The Navy wanted Able and his crew ready for public appearances, interviews, photographs, war bond rallies. The story was perfect. It showed American ingenuity, aggression, refusal to quit. Able ignored it. The publicity could wait. Getting his ship home came first. By May 17th, Buckley was 140 miles from New York. The engine ran hot, but steady. Hull patches leaked slightly more, but remained controllable. They had covered over 1,000 miles on one engine, with a hole torn through the hull. The crew was exhausted, sleep-deprived, worn down, operating on adrenaline and discipline, but they were close now. Close enough to believe they would make it. Then the bearing failed. Not catastrophically, yet, but enough that continuing posed serious risk. The chief engineer recommended immediate shutdown. They were still 135 miles out. Too far to drift. Able made the call. Run the engine until it died if necessary. Get close enough for a tow. The bearing might last another day. It might not. There was no alternative. The engine ran. Temperature climbed into critical range. Vibration worsened. Oil pressure fell. But it ran, hour after hour, mile after mile. By midnight on May 17th, Buckley was 90 miles from New York. Close enough. Able requested tug assistance. 2 ocean-going tugs departed New York Harbor at 0200 on May 18th. Estimated rendezvous, 1,400 hours. At 0630, the port engine ceased. Bearing failure. Total loss of power. But Buckley was 70 miles from port. The tugs were en route. All they had to do now was stay afloat. After 12 days limping across the Atlantic, they could finally stop fighting the ship. The engineering crew secured systems and assessed damage. The engine was destroyed, complete rebuild required, but it no longer mattered. At 14:15, the tugs arrived. Lines were secured. Tow established. Speed, 3 knots. Buckley was heading home. As the New York skyline emerged from the haze, the crew lined the rails. They had fought the only hand-to-hand naval battle of the war. They had sunk one of Germany's most successful submarines. They had sailed over 1,000 miles on one engine. They had survived. At 2,200 hours on May 18th, Buckley entered New York Harbor. Tugs guided her toward the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Crowds lined the shoreline. Cameras waited. Reporters gathered. The coffee mug story had made them famous. The crew didn't care. They wanted solid ground. Hot showers. Real sleep. Buckley was secured alongside Pier 12. Engines shut down, what was left of them. The gangway was prepared. Before anyone disembarked, Able gathered his crew. He told them what they already knew. Sinking U-66 would make headlines. The hand-to-hand fight would be remembered. But the real achievement was getting Buckley home, damaged, crippled, exposed, against odds that should have finished them. That was what mattered. On May 19th, Buckley was moved under tow to Boston Navy Yard for full assessment. Initial inspections showed repairs would take weeks, possibly months. Boston had the facilities required. She arrived on May 20th. In dry dock, the damage told the full story. The bow was bent 12 degrees to port from the ram. Forward compartments were crushed. The starboard shaft was not merely broken. The stern tube was cracked. Flooding had damaged electrical systems throughout the aft third of the ship. Hull plating showed stress fractures in 6 locations. The port engine was destroyed, bearings gone, crankshaft damaged beyond repair. Repairs would take 6 to 8 weeks. Buckley sat in dry dock, battered, scarred, a reminder of what modern warships looked like after fighting at knife range. Meanwhile, the crew became public figures. Newspapers ran the story for days. Radio shows repeated it. Newsreels filmed the twisted bow and crushed hull. Proof of the ram. Proof of the fight. Reporters asked about boarding. About fists. About coffee mugs. The sailors were uncomfortable with the attention. They hadn't done anything special. They'd used what was available. When enemies climbed onto their ship, they fought them. Sometimes that meant rifles. Sometimes it meant a coffee cup. They didn't see the difference. The public did. On August 31st, 1944, a formal award ceremony was held at Boston Navy Yard. Lieutenant Commander Brent Able stepped forward first. Navy Cross. The citation detailed his leadership, the undetected approach in bright moonlight, silencing U-60 SIXS guns within 4 minutes, the decision to ram, the defense against boarding. No mention of coffee mugs. That detail remained in the action reports. Other crew members received commendations. The ship earned a Navy Unit Commendation. Buckley received a Battle Star for the European African Middle Eastern Theater. Repairs continued through June. A new bow was fabricated and installed. The starboard shaft replaced. The engine rebuilt. Electrical systems restored. By June 14th, Buckley was whole again. Not new, but ready. The coffee mugs that survived the fight were saved. Some crewmen kept them. Unofficial relics. From a night when modern naval warfare briefly returned to fists, steel, and whatever was within reach. The coffee mugs became relics, reminders of the strangest weapons ever used in United States naval combat. But USS Buckley's war was not finished. After repairs and refresher training at Casco Bay, Maine, she returned to duty. From July through November 1944, Buckley escorted convoys across the Atlantic to North Africa, shepherding slow, vulnerable merchant ships through waters still stalked by German submarines. Afterward, she resumed anti-submarine patrols along the U.S. East Coast, a quieter assignment, but no less essential. On April 19, 1945, Buckley fought again. Operating with destroyer escort USS Reuben James, she helped track and sink U-548 in the North Atlantic. There was no ramming this time. No boarding. No hand-to-hand combat. Just sonar contact, depth charges, coordinated maneuvering, standard procedure, executed cleanly. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Buckley escorted one final convoy to Algeria in June and July, then returned to the United States. Her combat record was complete. 2 U-boats sunk, dozens of convoys protected, thousands of miles patrolled, and one engagement so improbable it would outlive everything else she had done. The hand-to-hand fight became required reading at the U.S. Naval Academy. A case study in unconventional combat. Proof that even in modern warfare, situations arise where doctrine collapses and improvisation decides survival. But the lesson was never about coffee mugs. It was about adaptability. Able rammed because ramming was the only option left. The crew fought hand-to-hand because the enemy was too close for guns. They used what was available because waiting for ideal conditions meant death. That was the lesson. The mugs were simply the detail no one forgot. Buckley was decommissioned on July 3, 1946, placed in reserve at the St. Johns River, Florida. The Atlantic was safe. Destroyer escorts were no longer needed in wartime numbers. Buckley joined hundreds of ships in mothballs, maintained, preserved, waiting for a war that might never come. In 1949, she was redesignated DR-51, a radar picket destroyer escort. The change was administrative. She never returned to active service. In 1954, she reverted to DE-51, still inactive. For 23 years, Buckley sat in reserve. Paint faded, systems aged, and the bent bow, the scar from ramming U-66, remained visible decades later. Sailors visiting the reserve fleet would stop, point it out, tell the story. The coffee mugs were always mentioned. In 1969, Buckley was struck from the Naval Register. She was sold for scrap. Some veterans tried to preserve the bow as a memorial. The effort failed. No funding, no institutional support. By 1970, Buckley was gone entirely, cut apart, and recycled. Steel melted down. The hull erased. But the story survived. Naval historians kept it alive. The Naval Academy continued teaching it. Museums requested artifacts. In 1973, Brent Able received a letter from Hermann Hartmann, a former crewman of U-66, one of the 36 Germans Buckley had pulled from the Atlantic. Hartmann wanted to say thank you. Thank you for saving their lives. Thank you for fair treatment after the battle. Able was surprised. Nearly 30 years had passed. He had moved on. Law practice, family, civilian life. But the letter was sincere. Respectful. It mentioned something Abel had never fully considered. The German survivors had always wanted to meet the men they had fought. War had made them enemies. Peace allowed something else. Abel helped organize a reunion. Germany, 1978. Former Buckley sailors met former U-66 crewmen. Gray-haired now. Slower. But memory sharp. The Germans remembered the mugs. The Americans remembered the look in Klaus Herbig's eyes when he surrendered. Both sides remembered the confusion, the fear, the violence of fighting at arm's length. The reunion was emotional. 24 Germans had died when U-66 went down. But the survivors held no grudges. War was war. Duty was duty. What mattered was what happened after. That Buckley's crew had chosen to rescue enemies instead of leaving them to drown. That mattered more than the fight. The Germans brought photographs. U-66 before the war. Young faces. Smiling crews. Another photo showed damage from earlier attacks. Depth charges, aircraft strafing. U-66 had survived many close calls. She could not survive 16 minutes with a determined destroyer escort. Abel brought the action report. The Germans read it carefully. They corrected nothing of substance. The fight had unfolded exactly as described, including the boarding, the ramming, the coffee mugs, and the final moments when their captain went down with his boat. Mutual respect replaced former enmity. They had shared something few could understand: combat measured in feet, not miles. Personal violence inside a mechanized war. Survival on both sides. Abel later said he was proud of sinking U-66. Proud of his crew. But he wished he could have saved more lives, including the captain who stayed aboard. Brent Abel died in 2007, age 91. His obituary led with USS Buckley and U-66. Not the thousands of miles patrolled. Not the later victories. Just those 16 minutes on May 6, 1944. The survivors stayed in touch afterward. Letters. Phone calls. An unlikely fraternity. Men who had tried to kill each other using the most primitive means imaginable during the most technologically advanced war in history. Klaus Herbig, U-60SIX's first officer, attended several reunions. He never apologized for boarding Buckley. It had been his duty, to distract, to buy time. The failure didn't make it wrong. Abel understood. Both had made hard decisions that night. Both had done what they believed necessary. The coffee mugs became legend. Museums wanted them. Collectors offered money. Most veterans refused. These weren't artifacts. They were reminders. One mug eventually reached the U.S. Navy Museum in Washington, D.C. The display label is plain. Coffee mug used as weapon. USS Buckley vs. U-66, May 6, 1944. Most visitors assume it's symbolic. It isn't. Scholars later dissected the engagement. One question kept returning. Why did U-66 attempt to board? Standard doctrine called for disengagement or scuttling. But the captain saw an opening. The boarding was desperation, but calculated desperation. It nearly worked. The collision damage proved that if U-66 had struck 6 feet further aft, Buckley might have sunk. Both commanders abandoned doctrine when survival demanded it. That is the real lesson. Not mugs. Not ramming. But the moment when rules collapse and only will, judgment, and improvisation remain. U-60SIX's wreck has never been found. She lies somewhere beneath 3,000 meters of Atlantic, unreachable in 1944. Perhaps reachable today. No one has looked. The wreck isn't the story. The story is 16 minutes when modern naval warfare became ancient, when technology failed, distance vanished, and humans fought face to face. And survived.